So here's an example of when sweat soldering would be very useful. I want to solder this logo onto this sheet for a sort of metal business card to show with my work. So I've drawn out in Sharpie where I want this piece to go. Then I flipped the piece over and lined it up on the back as well. Where I outlined in Sharpie, I also used a scribe. In a pinch, you can use something like a sharp pointed screw, any iron or steel object harder than the metal you're working with. Because when I solder these, the Sharpie is going to disappear, and I want to still be able to see that scribed line. So the first thing I'm going to do, because I want a really neat sweat solder, if I can, I only want the solder to flow in between these two pieces. If I can avoid any solder on the surface, that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to flux the back of this piece really well in this area, and I'm going to flow some solder over it and then pickle it. I'm going to use hard solder because I may or may not do another solder seam or piece on this, and I want to make things as easy as possible for myself if I decide to do another solder joint. So this flux is not ideal. It was really old and dried up, but I put some water in it. It's going to take a while for it to reach the level of consistency that I want. So I'm just dealing with what I have. I've chopped it up into tiny chunks, and I've got my flux and the suspended in my water mixture. So as I give my flux a few minutes to dry, I'm going to go ahead and cut my solder. I'm using hard solder sheet. The trick with soldering is you don't want to use too much solder if you want things to be neat. You always want to do things right the first time to minimize cleanup versus try to clean things up after the fact. Okay, so here's my flame. It's not a very large flame. That's what I'm going to be working with. You can see the blue cone is maybe 1/3 of an inch long. I'm going to move my flux container and kind of heat the metal. I want to dissolve the water and leave the flux behind, because you see those bubbles? If that starts boiling while I'm working on it after I put my solder down, my solder is going to move around. It's not going to stay exactly where I want it, and I want to be very precise. So all that white residue there is, that's the flux that's left behind. I think that's probably good. It's probably as much as I want. Now I am going to find my tweezers, and I have my tiny pieces of solder that I've cut. I'm going to place them where I want the solder to flow. I want to be careful to add a piece anywhere that has a very small thin area where the solder might have trouble flowing to that area. I want to go ahead and put a piece on there. I also don't want to use too much solder. Again, I want to avoid cleanup if possible. Alright, I think that should be good. I'm going to move this piece here. Alright, so now when I heat up my piece to flow my solder, my pieces aren't going to be jumping around. Hard solder 2. Again, here's my tip. I'm going to turn it down a little bit. Oops, that was a little too much. Again, here's my tip. I'm going to turn it down. Got about 1/3 of an inch maybe. Hard solder, it doesn't flow as quickly as easy or medium. So you need to get to a higher temperature. And the one thing about hard solder, it also does not reflow as easily. So if you knew you were only doing one sweat solder, You can see the Sharpie burning off now. So all that's left of my designated area are my scribe marks. But if you knew you were only doing one solder, you could just use medium or easy, and then you would not have to worry about the solder reflowing. You see we're almost there. I want to heat the piece very evenly. Keep the flame heading straight down as much as possible. Almost to temperature. You can see them beating up, and there we go. Bam, 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 bam. Alright, so I did not heat the piece evenly, so those do not all flow at the same time. I could have put, it looks like this area here is also within my designated area. I could have put a little bit more solder there than I did. I'm going to pickle it and see how it looks after that. So, piece out of the pickle, and you can see where the solder flowed. It's just kind of pooled where those pieces were. I'm not going to put any more down. There's some residual flux here. If I left this in the pickle longer, the flux would burn off, but I'm going to be impatient and I'm not going to do that. And I'm going to add fresh flux to this piece as well. Again, we want it enough to prevent oxidation. We want this solder to flow very beautifully. I'm only fluxing on this piece where I want the solder to go. So hopefully if I have too much solder, it will, if I'm lucky, you never want to count on luck, it'll still stay where I want it to be. So let's see. We line this up, and this bottom piece is still kind of hot, but I can see my Sharpie lines on my bottom half because I have not soldered on it, and I can tell, that's the camera for you, I can tell that I have this piece where I want it to be. So because I have this overhang here, you see how my piece is tilting? I want it very flat. So I'm going to take a scrap of metal that is about the same width to prop it up so I can keep things as flat as possible. Again, be careful if you have hot metal. Let's use this one's smaller. This one has paper on the back, so that's going to burn off when I heat this. Okay. So we got it lined up, and when this starts to settle, after that flux boils, this metal will help support it. You can use a scribe, your tweezers to kind of move things around, keep things in place as you go. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to use a little bit of a larger flame here because I have more metal to heat up. I'm also going to start with a larger piece of metal because this is going to be a heat sink. So even though I want the metal to flow over here, I want the solder to flow over here, it's not going to flow, it's not going to do what I want it to unless I can get this base metal at the right temperature. If you get the larger piece at the right temperature, the smaller piece, especially because that top piece has lots of holes cut out of it, it's going to be faster to heat up. It's going to be a lot easier to get it to do what you want. You can see that color there and the translucent flux. We're getting to the right temperature. The metal has settled, the flux is boiled. Now I'm going to fixate on the area that I want the solder to flow, but again, I'm focusing my heat on that bottom sheet of metal, not on the top sheet. That's especially important if you're working with really small pieces of metal where you might melt it. And I think I'm almost there. I think I got it. I'm at flow temperature. You can see in that seam. You can see the seam going. Alright. So one sign that I did something right, see this seam is very, very clean from all the flux between there. The question is, does it also have solder on it. I can't tell. So I'm going to let this cool off and then put it in the pickle. And once I've pickled it, it'll clean off any flux that might be holding them together, and I'll see if I actually got a solder seam. I don't see much solder out here to the edges on the top half. The side looks like it flowed, and the top, I'm not sure. So we'll pickle it and then we'll find out. Again, let it cool for a few moments so that you don't end up with it torquing from being dropped into your cool or slightly warm pickle. Okay, so I have pickled and brass brushed my piece to clean off most of the oxidation and flux. It's still got a little bit of flux I need to clean off, but I can at least see the seams and see how I did. It's a little bit hard to see on here, but if this hadn't flowed all the way out to the edges, you would see a gap, and if you tried, you could probably like hook your fingernail underneath it. Sometimes you might see a little silver line of the solder, and it looks like my seams, at least on the outer edge, did really well. So this is perfect. I just need to clean the rest of the flux off of it with pickle. I'm going to put ink in here and then powder coat it, clean it up. Let me show you what happened in my first one. I used too much flux, too much solder, and you can see all up here where all these narrow holes were, just like on this, the solder just jumped through the holes and came out in the front. So I'm going to have to clean all that off. It's going to take me a lot of time, and it's going to be hard to keep it as neat as this. So that's what happens when you use too much solder. The other thing that can happen very easily with sweat soldering is you don't use enough solder and then you have gaps. And if you haven't fluxed both sides really well, then you might have a hole underneath where the solder hasn't flowed and you can see it, but because it's gotten so dirty in there and then it's hard for the pickle to get in there because it's such a cramped space, sometimes it's next to impossible to undo it. If that happens, I would reflow your solder, pull the pieces apart, and start over. So there you go. Beautiful sweat soldered piece.